They go quiet, they step back, they answer with less warmth, less energy, less of themselves, and that cold shift can feel like the end. But what if it is not the end at all? What if the distance you feel is not proof that they stopped caring, but proof that something inside them has become too loud to handle? Stay with this, because most people get this part completely wrong. When someone avoidant becomes distant, the easy story is that they are done, bored, or emotionally empty. But sometimes the truth is the exact opposite. Sometimes your presence starts living in their mind more intensely the moment they pull away from your life. What looks like silence on the outside can hide overthinking on the inside. What looks like indifference can be emotional overload wearing a mask. And if you have ever stared at a cold message, a delayed reply, or a sudden wall where warmth used to be, this will hit deeper than you expect, because the real question is not why they look calm. The real question is what that calm is covering, and once you see that, you cannot unsee it. So before you assume their distance means nothing, watch closely. Listen between the pauses. There is more happening here than most people will ever notice. And by the end of this, you may understand why the person acting like you do not matter could actually be thinking about you far more than they want to admit. When an avoidant person creates space, most people read it in the most direct way possible. They think distance means disinterest, silence means detachment, cold behavior means feelings are gone. On the surface, that sounds logical. We are trained to judge emotion by what we can see. If someone cares, they move closer. If someone does not care, they move away. Simple, clean, easy to understand. But human behavior is not always that simple, and this pattern especially is full of hidden contradictions. For an avoidant person, distance is often not emotional emptiness. It is emotional management. It is the nervous system trying to calm down after closeness starts to feel too intense. The problem is not always the other person. The problem is what intimacy wakes up inside them. Closeness can touch fear they do not know how to explain, dependence, vulnerability, exposure, the feeling that another person is starting to matter too much. And that is where the shift begins. The more meaningful the bond becomes, the more their inner alarm starts to rise. So right when the connection begins to feel real, they pull back. Right when it matters, they become harder to reach. Not because nothing is there, but because too much is there. And if you have ever felt confused by that timing, that is why. The retreat often starts exactly where deeper feeling begins. Inside that pattern is a strange paradox that can drive the other person crazy. They step away to create relief, yet the very act of stepping away keeps the connection alive inside them. They leave the conversation, but not the thought of it. They stop expressing emotion, but the emotion does not stop moving. In many cases, it gets stronger because it no longer has an open path out. Instead of being spoken, it turns inward. Instead of being shared, it becomes thought, and thought repeats. It circles, it replays moments late at night and fills silence with unfinished emotional tension. This is why someone can look distant while still being mentally absorbed. They may revisit old messages, replay your tone, analyze a glance, rethink what they said, rethink what you meant, then tell themselves to calm down while their mind keeps returning to the same place. Watch this part carefully because it matters. Avoidant people often process through reflection instead of expression. They try to think their way through feelings they do not want to fully feel in real time. That means a moment that lasts 5 minutes on the outside can echo for hours or days on the inside. And yes, that is why their withdrawal can be so misleading. The outside says, move on. The inside says, this is not over. If this is making sense already, stay with me, because the deeper layer explains why the coldness can actually rise when the connection becomes more important. When a feeling is not expressed, it does not always disappear. Very often, it changes form. It becomes tension. It becomes overthinking. It becomes private attachment with no release. An avoidant person may refuse to speak what is happening inside, but that refusal does not erase the feeling. It compresses it. It pushes it inward until it lives in the mind as a kind of quiet pressure. That pressure can show up in distraction, obsessive reflection, strange mood shifts, or sudden mental focus on the very person they are trying to hold at a distance. The more they try to control it, the more it can settle deeper into their inner world. This is why emotional suppression is so deceptive. On the outside, it looks calm. On the inside, it can be relentless. They may seem collected, maybe even unaffected, while privately replaying interactions again and again, searching for a safe way to understand what they feel without having to expose it. And because nothing is being openly resolved, the loop stays active. What is unspoken keeps asking for attention. What is hidden keeps returning. It is like shutting a door on a storm and pretending the weather is gone because the room looks still. But the storm is still there. It is just happening behind the wall. And this is the part many people miss. They assume visible warmth is the only proof of emotion. But sometimes the most intense emotions are the least visible. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is carrying the loudest inner conflict. And if you have ever thought, if they cared, they would just say it, remember this. Not everyone speaks from feeling. Some people hide inside it. At the center of this behavior is fear, but not always the obvious kind. It is not always fear of being hurt in the dramatic sense. Often, it is fear of being affected too deeply, fear of losing emotional control, fear of needing someone, fear of feeling changed by closeness in a way they cannot easily manage. For a person who relies on self-containment, intimacy can feel less like comfort and more like exposure. To care deeply is to become open. To become open is to become touchable. And to become touchable can feel dangerous when your whole system has learned to survive by staying inward, steady, independent, and hard to reach. So when closeness starts crossing an internal threshold, the mind reacts fast. Sometimes before they even fully understand what is happening, they reduce contact, they go colder, they speak less, they become harder to read. That withdrawal gives them the illusion of control, but only on the surface, because stepping back may lower external pressure while the internal experience keeps moving without resolution. This is why someone can look detached and still be emotionally occupied. The retreat does not cancel attachment. It simply changes how attachment is carried. It becomes more hidden, more private, more mental, and here is the hard truth. The person receiving that coldness often feels rejected, while the avoidant person often feels overwhelmed. One sees absence, the other feels too much. That mismatch creates pain, confusion, and endless second-guessing. So if you have ever wondered why they became distant, exactly when things felt meaningful, this is part of the answer. The connection did not become too small, it became too real. Cold behavior is often misread because people confuse reduced expression with reduced feeling, but those are not the same thing. Someone can show less and still feel more. In fact, sometimes they show less because what they feel has become too intense, too uncertain, or too risky to reveal. Strong attachment can bring with it expectation, vulnerability, and the possibility of emotional dependence. For someone uncomfortable with those states, restraint feels safer than honesty. Silence feels safer than clarity. Distance feels safer than being seen, so they dim the outward signal. They become harder to read. They offer less warmth, not because warmth is gone, but because showing it would make the whole experience more real. And once it becomes more real, it becomes harder to control. This is why their behavior can feel so contradictory. They may care, think, remember, and still act cold. They may miss you and avoid you in the same breath. They may feel pulled toward you while also protecting themselves from the very pull they cannot deny. Pause here for a second, because this is where most people either understand the pattern or completely miss it. Avoidant distance is not always a blank space. Sometimes it is a shield, a way of managing inner intensity without having to explain it, a way of staying connected in secret while appearing disconnected in public. And because that contradiction is painful to live with, it often turns into more withdrawal, more overthinking, and more emotional delay. The outside grows colder while the inside grows louder. That is why the silence can stretch on, even when the person remains mentally and emotionally involved. Their inner world is usually far more active than their outer behavior reveals. What looks still is often full of motion. They revisit moments after they end. They replay conversations. They study your words, your timing, your tone, the subtle meaning behind small things most people would forget. While another person might speak quickly, ask directly, or clear the air in real time, the avoidant mind often moves slower and deeper in private. It needs distance to process, but that same distance also keeps the connection mentally alive, so what could have been resolved in a short exchange becomes a long private cycle of reflection. They think instead of saying, they analyze instead of asking, they withdraw instead of clarifying, and because the process stays inside, no one sees how much movement is actually happening. Outwardly, they may seem fine, calm, unbothered, even cold. Inwardly, there may be tension, longing, confusion, resistance, and a private emotional current they do not know how to turn off. This matters because it explains why their silence can last while their attention does not disappear. The person they stepped away from may remain psychologically present for far longer than anyone would guess, not always in a dramatic romantic fantasy, often in subtle, recurring thought, a phrase remembered while driving, a memory resurfacing before sleep, a message almost sent and then deleted, an urge to reach out, followed by immediate restraint. If you have seen that pattern before, you know how haunting it can feel, and if you have lived it from the inside, you know the battle is not between caring and not caring, it is between feeling and allowing the feeling to be seen. There is also the fear of being consumed by closeness, a fear that rarely announces itself in clear words. It works quietly beneath awareness. It says, if this goes deeper, I might lose myself, I might lose my balance, I might lose the space that helps me feel safe. So even when warmth is real in the beginning, even when interest is genuine, once emotional intimacy starts growing, something shifts. The bond stops feeling simple, it starts carrying weight. The avoidant person senses that this connection could matter enough to affect their emotional stability, and that possibility alone can trigger retreat. This is where the push and pull begins. They move closer while it feels manageable. They enjoy the bond while the intensity stays within limits. But once it passes a hidden line, they step back to restore distance and regain a sense of separateness. From the outside, it looks inconsistent. Present one day, distant the next. Open, then shut down. But inside, it follows a logic. Closeness activates fear. Fear creates withdrawal. Withdrawal reduces pressure for a moment. Then longing returns. Then connection pulls again. Then the cycle restarts. And the more meaningful the connection becomes, the stronger this loop can get. That is why the behavior can feel so confusing to the other person. It looks like mixed signals, and in a way it is, but not because the feelings are fake. It is because two opposite needs are alive at the same time, the need for connection and the need for protection. Neither fully wins, so the relationship gets stuck in a rhythm of approach and retreat, warmth and coldness, presence and disappearance. Silence, in this pattern, is not empty space. It is a strategy. It removes immediate pressure. It avoids emotional exposure. It delays consequences. Words open doors, and open doors lead to response, expectation, vulnerability, and change. Silence closes the door before those things can happen. It gives the avoidant person a place where nothing more is being asked of them, at least from the outside. They can pause, think, regulate, and avoid having to define what they feel before they are ready. For someone whose emotional processing is slow, inward, and highly controlled, that pause can feel necessary. Conversation asks for presence now. Intimacy asks for truth now, but their system may not know how to move that fast, so they go quiet to match the world to their internal rhythm. The problem is that silence protects them from external demand without resolving the emotion itself. It keeps them safe from the conversation while leaving them alone with the feeling, and that can make the internal loop even stronger. They do not stop thinking about you because they stop replying. They may think more because nothing has been spoken clearly. The silence becomes a container for unfinished meaning. What could have been clarified remains suspended. What could have been expressed stays charged. And that is why their silence can feel so heavy. It is not always because nothing exists. Sometimes it is because too much exists without form. So if you have been tempted to read silence as certainty, be careful. Silence can mean absence, yes. But in this pattern, silence often means conflict, control, and private emotional movement that has not found words yet. The deepest struggle here is not simple hesitation. It is a constant inner friction between two strong forces that do not easily live together. One part wants closeness, warmth, understanding, and the feeling of being deeply known. Another part wants distance, self-protection, autonomy, and freedom from emotional dependence. These forces do not cancel each other out. They operate at the same time, which is exactly why the behavior becomes so hard to read. When they meet someone who truly affects them, the desire for connection becomes stronger, but so does the need to protect themselves from what that connection could demand. They may imagine a deeper bond while also fearing what deeper attachment would do to their sense of control. So they move toward the person and away from the person, sometimes almost in the same emotional breath. That is not random. It is the visible shape of an unresolved internal war. Each step closer wakes fear, each step back wakes longing, each moment of warmth increases risk, each moment of distance increases mental return, and because the connection is never fully embraced or fully released, it stays alive in the mind. It remains unfinished, suspended, revisited. This is why the person can become a recurring presence in thought, not simply because the feelings are strong, but because they are unresolved. The mind returns to what has not settled. It circles what has not been completed. It keeps trying to find clarity where emotion is still split, and that unfinished inner movement can last far longer than people expect, especially when no honest conversation ever comes to give it shape. What makes this even more intense is that private processing can amplify emotion. When feelings are shared, they move, they breathe, they change in contact with another person, but when they stay sealed inside, they often grow sharper edges. The avoidant person may question themselves again and again. Why do I care this much? Why did that message affect me? Why do I want closeness and distance at the same time? Why can I not just relax into this? That mental effort can make the connection feel even bigger because it is being carried alone, without the release that comes from mutual understanding. They may try to rationalize what they feel, minimize it, or tell themselves to focus elsewhere, yet the bond keeps returning because nothing inside has fully settled. And this is where a lot of people make the wrong call. They assume a quiet person has moved on. They assume a cold person feels nothing. They assume no action means no attachment. But hidden attachment is still attachment. Unspoken emotion is still emotion. Private longing is still longing. It just wears a harder face. If you are still watching mentally, hold on, because this next part matters. The person who seems most controlled is not always the person who is least affected. Sometimes they are the one working hardest to stop their inner world from spilling out. Sometimes the calm is labor. Sometimes the distance is defense. Sometimes the stillness is the mask worn by someone who feels more than they know how to carry. And once you understand that, a lot of confusing behavior starts making painful sense. Still, this does not mean every distant person is secretly consumed. It does not mean every silence is love in disguise, and this is important. The pattern only makes sense when there has been real emotional significance, real closeness, real tension between connection and retreat. Without that, distance may simply be distance. But when the bond has clearly mattered, when the pull was real, when the warmth existed, and then suddenly turned into cold restraint, this inner logic becomes much more likely. The retreat is not always the death of feeling. Sometimes it is the result of feeling becoming difficult to manage. That does not make the behavior easy to receive. It does not make it healthy. It does not remove the pain it causes, but it does explain why someone can disappear outwardly while remaining deeply active inwardly, and that explanation matters, especially for the person left behind trying to decode every shift, because once you understand the difference between emotional absence and emotional avoidance, you stop reading every cold moment the same way. You stop confusing concealment with emptiness. You stop assuming that lack of expression always means lack of impact, and maybe most importantly, you stop taking every retreat as a simple statement of your worth. Sometimes the distance says more about their fear than about your value. Sometimes their silence is about their threshold, not your importance. And sometimes the person acting the most detached is the one trying hardest not to drown in what they feel. That truth does not excuse the confusion, but it changes the meaning of it. So in the end, what looks cold is often not empty at all. What looks like indifference can be guarded intensity. What looks like distance can be a mind trying to control feelings that have become too present, too personal, too hard to hold openly. Their silence is not always random. Their contradictions are not always meaningless. Their withdrawal can be the outer shape of an inner struggle between attachment and fear, desire and defense, closeness and self-protection. They step back because the bond matters enough to shake something inside them. They go quiet because speaking would make the emotion more real. They reduce warmth because warmth would expose just how deeply they are being moved. And while the outside may show stillness, inside there can be replaying, reflecting, resisting, missing, and remembering. That is the paradox. They retreat to escape intensity, but the retreat often keeps the intensity alive. They hide to feel safer, but hiding can make the feeling last longer. They act distant to regain control, while privately losing more mental space to the person they are trying not to need. If you have ever faced this kind of coldness, you know how confusing it can be, but now you also know why it can happen. Not because nothing is there, because something is, something powerful enough to matter, yet unsettling enough to trigger defense. And that is why the person acting like they do not care may be thinking about you far more than they would ever let you see. If this spoke to something you have lived, you already know how silent these storms can be and how loud they really are.